Hey there. Welcome to Midnight Sleep Crime. I'm here to help you relax tonight. Before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and don't forget to subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Your one click to subscribe means the world to me. Let's hit 1,000 subscribers together and grow this family of true crime lovers. Story 1. The night was meant to be nothing more than a celebration. It was October 31st, 2001, the kind of autumn evening where the streets of State College, Pennsylvania, were alive with costumes, laughter, and the playful chaos of Halloween. Pumpkins glowed faintly from porches, music spilled from dorm windows, and the crisp air carried the scent of fallen leaves. Among the hundreds of students drifting between parties was Cindy Song, a 21-year-old junior at Penn State University. She had dressed as a playful bunny that night, a silky black outfit, fuzzy rabbit ears, and a small cotton tail pinned behind her. Friends remembered her costume being light-hearted, cheerful, exactly the kind of thing Cindy would wear. She wasn't shy about enjoying life, about leaning into the fun of the moment. Cindy was known for her infectious smile, her creativity, and her warm, curious spirit. She loved art, music, and late-night talks with friends. For many, she was the kind of person who made spaces brighter just by being there. But none of her friends could have imagined that this Halloween, this ordinary night of laughter and costumes, would be the last time they would ever see her. After a long night of parties, Cindy was dropped off at her apartment around 4 a.m. by her friends. She was tired but in good spirits. They watched her walk toward her apartment, keys in hand. She waved, smiling, before disappearing into the dim glow of the entryway. That was the last confirmed sighting of Cindy Song. Hours later, when friends tried to reach her, she didn't answer her phone. She didn't show up for class. She didn't show up for work. Her apartment, when police entered, seemed oddly staged in fragments. Her false eyelashes were left on the bathroom sink, a bowl of noodles sat half-eaten, and her phone, purse, and keys were all inside. It looked as though she had stepped out for just a moment. But Cindy never returned. Her disappearance would spiral into one of Pennsylvania's most haunting unsolved mysteries, a case that pulled in local police, the FBI, and even possible ties to a brutal serial killer. And yet, more than 2 decades later, the answers still remain buried in silence. What really happened to Cindy Song on that cold Halloween night? And why has no one ever been able to bring her home? When trying to understand the weight of a disappearance, you must first understand the life that was taken from the world. For many, the name Cindy Song is linked only to mystery, the unsolved case of a young woman who vanished after Halloween night. But Cindy was far more than a cold file or a cautionary tale whispered on college campuses. She was a daughter, a friend, a dreamer, and someone who carried a story long before it became entwined with tragedy. From South Korea to America. Hyunjong Cindy Song was born in 1979 in South Korea. Her childhood was shaped by family, tradition, and the rhythm of a culture deeply rooted in community. Like many children, she laughed easily, loved deeply, and dreamed about the future in bright, unbroken lines. Her parents remembered her as imaginative, artistic, and endlessly curious about the world. When she was still a teenager, Cindy's family made the difficult decision to send her to the United States to live with relatives. It was not uncommon for Korean families to hope their children might find greater opportunities abroad, particularly in education. And so, Cindy came to live with an aunt and uncle in Springfield, Virginia, a quiet suburb just outside Washington, D.C. For Cindy, it was a leap into a new language, a new culture, and a new world. Many immigrants speak of the loneliness that follows such a move, and Cindy was no different. But those who knew her said she adapted with grace and courage. She absorbed English quickly, never shying away from expressing herself. She blended into American culture with ease, all while holding on to the quiet strength of her Korean heritage. Growing up in Virginia, at West Springfield High School, Cindy quickly became known for her friendly nature. Teachers admired her hard work, while classmates remembered her sense of style and the way she carried herself with quiet confidence. She wasn't the loudest person in the room, but she had an energy that drew people toward her, a mixture of warmth and mischief. Friends later recalled that Cindy had an aura about her. She was not only beautiful in appearance, delicate features, expressive eyes, a bright smile, but also in the way she made people feel comfortable around her. If you were struggling, Cindy noticed. If you were celebrating, she celebrated with you. But her life was not without its struggles. The move to the US was permanent, and while she had loving relatives, her parents remained in South Korea. That distance weighed on her. She missed home, missed the small comforts of her childhood, and missed the closeness of her parents. Letters and occasional visits bridged the gap, but the ache of distance lingered. Still, Cindy pressed forward, chasing her goals with determination. She had a talent for art and creativity, which carried into her college years. Penn State University. By the late 1990s, Cindy enrolled at Pennsylvania State University, one of the largest universities in the U.S., a sprawling campus full of possibility. She chose to major in integrative arts, a program that allowed her to combine different disciplines of creativity, visual art, design, and media. For Cindy, it was the perfect path, a way to fuse her passions into something uniquely her own. Penn State was a lively place, a world of late-night diners, football games, packed libraries, and endless social circles. Cindy fit into this environment seamlessly. She joined clubs, made friends easily, and became part of the bustling social fabric of the university. Those who knew her on campus described her as bubbly and outgoing, someone who loved to dance, laugh, and surround herself with friends. She wasn't someone who spent all her time buried in books or isolated in her room. Instead, she sought out connections. Cindy loved music festivals, the creativity of fashion, and the joy of parties where laughter stretched deep into the night. But there was more to her than just social energy. Friends also remembered her as sensitive and reflective. Cindy journaled, she drew, she daydreamed. Beneath her bubbly personality was a young woman with depth, someone who was still figuring out who she was in the world. The way she cared. Cindy's life, though full of promise, was not free of pain. Like many young adults navigating independence, she experienced loneliness. The distance from her parents weighed heavily, and she sometimes confided in friends about feeling overwhelmed. There were moments when sadness seemed to press against her, moments when she tried to balance who she was expected to be with who she truly felt she was. At times, Cindy wrestled with depression, though she hid it well behind her outgoing personality. Friends later admitted that they hadn't fully grasped the depth of her struggles until after her disappearance, when every detail of her life was dissected. Still, she carried on. Cindy was resilient. She threw herself into her studies, into friendships, into experiences that made her feel alive. Her circle of friends. By 2001, Cindy had built a tight circle of friends at Penn State. They were the people she laughed with, cried with, and celebrated with. They were the ones who knew her quirks, like her love of late-night snacks, her habit of doodling in the margins of her notebooks, her tendency to stay up too late talking about everything and nothing. Friends described her as someone who could turn an ordinary evening into something special. If you were bored, Cindy would suggest a spontaneous adventure. If you were sad, she'd sit with you until you felt better. She had a gift for making people feel less alone. It was this warmth, this magnetic personality, that made her disappearance so shocking. To imagine someone so vibrant simply vanishing was unthinkable. The weeks leading to Halloween. The autumn of 2001 was supposed to be a season of renewal for Cindy. She was back at school, surrounded by friends, and full of plans for the future. She had recently ended a long-term relationship, and though breakups are never easy, she seemed ready to move forward. Halloween was one of Cindy's favorite times of the year. She loved dressing up, loved the creativity of it, and loved the energy of campus during the holiday. That year, she planned her costume carefully, the playful bunny outfit that her friends would later recall with bittersweet clarity. She was excited about the night, excited to let loose and forget about stress for just a few hours. No one could have known that those hours would be the last anyone would ever spend with her. The human side of the mystery. It's easy, when discussing unsolved cases, to focus only on the mystery, the clues, the timelines, the suspects. But before Cindy Song became a missing person on a flyer, she was simply Cindy. A young woman who wanted what many want: joy, connection, love, and a sense of belonging. She wanted to graduate, to create art, to find her place in the world. She wanted to laugh with her friends, to fall in love again, to keep moving forward. Her disappearance didn't just rob her of those chances, it also robbed her friends, her family, and the world of everything she might have become. Cindy's life was not defined by her final night. It was defined by the years that came before, the courage of moving to a new country, the friendships she built, the dreams she carried. And yet, the tragedy of her disappearance lies in that sudden rupture. One moment she was a 21-year-old full of life, and the next she was gone, leaving only fragments of her presence behind. As Halloween night 2001 approached, Cindy could not have known that she was stepping into history, into a story that would haunt Pennsylvania for decades. The girl who once dreamed of building art, of shaping beauty out of the world's chaos, would herself become a haunting portrait, unfinished, unanswered, unresolved. The air was unusually crisp that October evening in 1982, as if Vancouver itself was bracing for something grim. The leaves had already curled into brittle shades of rust and brown, carpeting the sidewalks where children in costumes trotted door to door, clutching plastic pumpkins brimming with candy. But inside Cindy James' world, Halloween had little sweetness to offer. Instead, it carried shadows, the kind that crept in through the cracks of her life and refused to leave. Cindy had been receiving phone calls for weeks leading up to that night. The voice was always low, sometimes whispering, sometimes nothing more than a hiss of breath. She never knew if the calls came from a blocked number or a payphone, but each one froze her blood the same way. She had reported them, of course, countless times, but when police traced the line, it often came back inconclusive. "There's nothing here," they'd say, as though her fear was somehow manufactured. Still, Cindy tried to hold onto a sense of normalcy. She was, at her core, a caring and warm-hearted nurse, beloved by her patients. And that night, October 31st, she had been invited to a small Halloween gathering by her friend Agnes Woodcock, a loyal neighbor and confidant who had been growing increasingly concerned about her. Cindy dressed in a playful costume, something lighthearted, as though she was trying to shield herself from the heaviness of her reality. Friends later recalled that she seemed cheerful at first, laughing easily, even joking about her secret admirer who wouldn't leave her alone. But underneath, her smile had cracks. Anyone who looked closely enough could see the flicker of worry in her eyes. The party itself was modest. Close friends, some music, bowls of chips, the kind of cozy suburban gathering that didn't usually make the news. But as the evening wore on, Cindy excused herself, saying she wanted to head home early. She didn't live far, but the night had grown darker, the suburban streets emptied of children now tucked into bed, and the Halloween decorations, plastic skeletons swaying in the wind, jack-o'-lanterns flickering weakly, seemed suddenly ominous. Around midnight, the phone in Cindy's home rang again. She picked it up cautiously. No words this time, just heavy, ragged breathing. She slammed the receiver down, her hands trembling. Not long after, there was a sound outside her window. At first, she thought it was just the wind rattling the glass, but then came a scraping noise, deliberate and slow. She froze, staring at the curtains, terrified of pulling them back. Moments later, there was a crash. Cindy's porch light flickered, and she realized someone had cut it. She ran to the phone, dialing Agnes in a panic. "Agnes, someone's outside. Please, I need you." Agnes and her husband Tom rushed over. When they arrived, they found Cindy trembling in the corner of her living room, eyes wide with terror. Outside, the evidence was chilling. The wires to her porch light had been cleanly severed, and a message had been scrawled on her porch in crude block letters. Some accounts say it was a single word, soon. Others say it was something far darker, a threat left like a calling card. That night cemented something in Cindy's mind. Whoever was tormenting her wasn't going away. The calls, the letters, the break-ins, they weren't just random acts. They were escalating. Whoever it was wanted her to know she was being watched. The police, however, were less convinced. When they arrived and inspected the scene, they noted the cut wires but found no fingerprints, no footprints in the damp soil, nothing to indicate a clear suspect. Some officers even began to quietly speculate among themselves. Was Cindy staging these events? Was she exaggerating them for attention? But for Cindy and those who loved her, there was nothing staged about her terror. The shaking in her voice when she described the phone calls. The way her eyes darted to every window and door, as though expecting someone to burst in. The exhaustion from sleepless nights, jolted awake by phantom noises or the fear that someone was standing over her bed. Halloween 1982 became more than just another night of harassment. It marked the first time her friends directly witnessed how real and terrifying the campaign against her was. Agnes, who had always been supportive, grew fiercely protective after that night. She urged Cindy to stay at her home, to not spend nights alone. But Cindy, independent and quietly stubborn, refused to let fear dictate her life. In the weeks that followed, the harassment only escalated. She would find threatening notes shoved into her mailbox, sometimes decorated with grotesque drawings of corpses or knives. One note read, "You're dead, Cindy." Another simply said, "Soon." The handwriting was blocky, almost childlike, making it impossible to trace. And then there were the calls. Dozens of them. Sometimes minutes apart, sometimes days, as though the tormentor knew exactly when her nerves had started to settle before rattling her again. On one call, a man's voice growled, "I'll get you." On another, a whisper, "You can't hide." Occasionally, there was nothing but silence, the kind of silence that felt watched. Halloween night had opened a door, one that could no longer be closed. Cindy was trapped in a nightmare that felt endless. Her friends feared for her. The police doubted her. And somewhere, lurking in the shadows, her stalker, whether real or imagined, seemed to grow bolder with every passing day. For Cindy, October 31st, 1982, wasn't just another holiday. It was the night her private terror became a public one. It was proof, to her and to those close to her, that she was being hunted. And it was only the beginning. Cindy James thought the nightmare would fade after Halloween night. That cold October evening had left her shaken, her nerves frayed, but she believed the police presence, her reports, and her resilience would carry her through. But the weeks that followed proved to be far worse. What began as a cruel trick, or perhaps a warning, grew into a calculated campaign of terror, stretching years, intensifying until Cindy's life was consumed by paranoia, fear, and trauma. The first calls. A few days after Halloween, the phone rang in Cindy's Richmond home late at night. The call was brief, the voice almost indistinguishable, raspy, menacing. Sometimes there was only silence, heavy breathing, or a faint clicking sound, as though someone were recording her. At first, Cindy tried to dismiss them. She told herself it could be pranksters, kids in the neighborhood who had caught wind of her recent ordeal. But the frequency increased. Dozens of calls, always at night, often when she was most vulnerable, alone and ready to sleep. The content of the calls shifted too. What started as silence evolved into crude, threatening words. "You're going to die. We're watching you. Slut." Sometimes, the caller whispered her name slowly, dragging each syllable like a blade across glass. Singalai. Cindy kept meticulous notes of every call, documenting times, words, and her responses. This was her nature, methodical, detail-oriented. She wanted to prove she wasn't imagining things. Still, when she brought her journals to the police, their expressions betrayed skepticism. "Crank callers," one officer muttered. "Maybe a disgruntled patient," another suggested, since Cindy worked as a nurse and had crossed paths with countless difficult personalities. But Cindy knew this was more than a nuisance. It was personal. The letters and messages. Soon, the harassment expanded. Cindy began finding strange letters in her mailbox, sloppily written notes pieced together from magazine cutouts, like something from a crime movie. The words were chilling. Soon. Dead meat. You can't hide. One letter contained an explicit drawing of a corpse with eyes crossed out in red ink. Another bore only a single word scrawled violently across the page. Bitch. The notes came irregularly, just often enough to keep her unsettled. Some were placed in her mailbox, others left on her doorstep, once even tucked beneath her windshield wiper. Then came the vandalism. Cindy returned home one evening to find her pillow slashed open, feathers scattered across the bed. Another time, she walked into the kitchen to discover her phone cord had been cut cleanly, as though with surgical precision. What terrified her most was the implication: someone had been inside her house. The break-ins. On January 30th, 1983, Cindy came home after work to find her living room turned upside down. Cushions ripped, clothing strewn across the floor, family photos smashed. Oddly, her valuables remained untouched, no jewelry stolen, no money missing. The intruder hadn't come to rob her. Pinned to her dining table with a knife was another note: "You're next." Police arrived, photographed the scene, but their doubts lingered. There was no sign of forced entry. Had Cindy locked her door? Was she exaggerating the incident, maybe even staging it herself? The suggestion cut deep. Cindy had devoted her life to helping others as a nurse and counselor. She had no history of mental illness, no motive for creating such chaos. But the seed of suspicion planted by law enforcement would follow her for years. Meanwhile, Cindy's world shrank. She stopped hosting friends at her home, fearful of exposing them to danger. She avoided late nights outside, terrified she was being followed. The first direct assault came in January 1984. Cindy was found unconscious in her backyard by a friend who had come to check on her. A nylon stocking had been tied tightly around her neck. She bore bruises on her arms and legs, as though she had been dragged. When she regained consciousness at the hospital, Cindy's account was fractured. She remembered being grabbed from behind, something pressed over her mouth, then nothing. Doctors confirmed the ligature marks were consistent with strangulation, but again, police noted the lack of physical evidence. No footprints, no fingerprints, no signs of a break-in. Cindy was terrified. Her friends were horrified. Yet investigators continued to treat her with doubt. One officer even suggested she may have injured herself. But for those closest to Cindy, there was no question. This was the beginning of a deadly escalation. Escalation through fire. By 1985, Cindy's ordeal had reached a new, horrifying level. Fires began breaking out in and around her home. One night in April, Cindy awoke to the crackling sound of flames. Her basement was on fire, smoke filling the stairwell. She managed to escape and called 911. Firefighters contained the blaze, but investigators were disturbed to discover that the fire had been set deliberately, accelerant poured on the basement floor. 2 weeks later, another fire erupted, this time outside. Cindy's garage was set ablaze, the flames licking dangerously close to her car. Again, she escaped unharmed, but the message was clear: someone wanted her dead. Cindy's neighbors grew increasingly alarmed. Several reported seeing suspicious figures lurking near her property at night, but by the time police arrived, the individuals were gone. The pattern was relentless. Cindy could not predict when or how the next attack would come, only that it would. Psychological toll. The human mind can only endure so much. Cindy began to unravel under the constant stress. She lost weight, her sleep became fragmented by nightmares and late-night phone calls. She suffered panic attacks and crippling anxiety. She confided in her family and close friends, admitting she felt like a prisoner in her own life. Yet even they sometimes struggled to understand the scope of her terror. One friend recalled Cindy whispering in a trembling voice, "They won't stop until I'm dead." Her words, once dismissed as paranoia, began to feel chillingly prophetic. Police doubt. Despite the growing body of evidence, calls, letters, vandalism, fires, assaults, the police remained divided. Some believed Cindy was the victim of a sadistic stalker. Others suspected she was orchestrating the events herself, either for attention or due to psychological instability. This suspicion was fueled by the peculiar lack of physical evidence. How could someone stage so many attacks without ever being caught, without leaving fingerprints, footprints, or fibers? Cindy's credibility suffered, and with it, her sense of safety. She felt abandoned not only by the law but by the very institutions designed to protect her. The strangling incident. In December 1985, Cindy was discovered semi-conscious in a ditch by a motorist. Her hands and feet had been bound, a black nylon stocking tied around her neck. She had cuts and bruises across her body. The attack mirrored her earlier strangulation, but this time, Cindy claimed she remembered a chilling detail: voices. She heard two different men, laughing, taunting her as they dragged her. Still, no suspects were identified. No witnesses stepped forward. Once again, suspicion turned back on Cindy. For Cindy's loved ones, the pattern was clear. The stalker, or stalkers, was escalating, becoming bolder and more violent. For the police, the case grew stranger and more suspicious. By the mid-1980s, Cindy James was living in a waking nightmare. The calls, letters, break-ins, fires, and assaults had become a relentless cycle, each incident more terrifying than the last. Her friends feared for her life. Police doubted her sanity. Cindy herself teetered on the edge, caught between her desperate will to survive and the crushing weight of disbelief. The escalation phase had turned her existence into a war zone, her home a battleground. Cindy's story was no longer about harassment. It was about survival against an invisible, merciless enemy. And as Cindy confided to her sister one night, clutching a blanket for comfort, "It's only going to get worse." She wasn't wrong. Cindy James had survived years of harassment, torment, and threats that seemed to close in tighter with every passing month. But as 1985 gave way to 1986, and then again to 1987, her fragile sense of control began to erode. She was no longer the confident, warm-hearted nurse, daughter, and friend her loved ones remembered. Instead, Cindy was unraveling, psychologically, emotionally, and physically, as the relentless campaign against her intensified. Her world narrowed to one suffocating focus: survival. Yet paradoxically, she was living in a way that resembled anything but survival. She no longer trusted her home, her neighborhood, her phone, her own mind. Sleep deprivation, constant hypervigilance, and years of intimidation had driven her into a downward spiral from which she would never fully recover. The weight of fear. By 1986, Cindy was documenting everything: every phone call, every piece of threatening mail, every suspicious car she noticed tailing her. Her journals became obsessive, filled with descriptions of noises in the night, shadows she thought she saw outside her window, or the lingering sense of being watched when she dared to leave home. Friends visiting her noticed the change. Her once light-filled home now felt more like a bunker. Curtains were always drawn, multiple locks secured the doors, and she'd installed additional alarm systems. She lived behind a fortress of security, but nothing seemed to keep the menace at bay. The strain took a toll on her relationships too. Her parents and her sister, once her strongest support, began to feel helpless in the face of her despair. Her ex-husband, Roy Makepeace, remained in contact and tried to help, but Cindy's paranoia occasionally spilled onto him too. She wondered if even those closest to her could be trusted. Police involvement had long ago reached an impasse. They still suspected Cindy of fabricating at least some of the harassment. This doubt, combined with the absence of solid evidence, left her feeling abandoned by the very institutions meant to protect her. When she turned to private investigators, their involvement did little more than reinforce her sense of fear. The threats were real, but nobody seemed able or willing to stop them. The first major breakdown. It was in early 1986 that Cindy first experienced what her family would later describe as a complete emotional collapse. After yet another night of harassing phone calls filled with whispers, threats, and obscenities, Cindy locked herself in her bedroom. Hours later, when she failed to show up for work, a friend found her trembling, barely coherent, and unable to explain what had happened. She had been found with a nylon stocking tied tightly around her own neck. The stocking left deep, angry marks, evidence of strangulation. Cindy claimed that her attacker had broken into her home and tried to kill her, but had fled before finishing the job. Yet the absence of forced entry left investigators skeptical. For Cindy, however, the attempt felt horrifyingly real. Whether it was the work of her stalker or a manifestation of her collapsing mental state, she believed someone wanted her dead and had nearly succeeded. Her mental health deteriorated sharply after this episode. Friends described her as jittery, easily startled, and constantly on edge. Small noises sent her spiraling into panic. She was no longer functioning as a nurse in the same reliable way. her performance faltering under the weight of her anxieties. Eventually, doctors intervened. Cindy was placed under psychiatric care and admitted for evaluation. The official diagnosis pointed to severe anxiety, depression, and elements of post-traumatic stress disorder. Yet even the professionals were divided. Was Cindy the victim of prolonged stalking, or was she creating, consciously or unconsciously, the very threats that tormented her? Institutionalization. In 1986, Cindy was voluntarily admitted to a psychiatric hospital following a particularly alarming suicide attempt. She had injected herself with an overdose of morphine, a move that alarmed her family and investigators alike. She barely survived. During her hospital stay, doctors pressed Cindy about the events that had brought her there. Under sedation and therapy, she admitted something that would deepen the mystery. She confessed that at least some of the incidents, the phone calls, the notes, had been staged by her. But almost immediately, she retracted the statement, insisting she had only said so to appease doctors who didn't believe her story. This confession left a scar on her credibility. For law enforcement, it confirmed long-held suspicions that Cindy was orchestrating at least part of her victimization. For her family, it was a moment of devastating doubt. They wanted desperately to believe her, but the lines between fact and delusion were blurring beyond recognition. Yet, even inside the hospital walls, Cindy remained terrified. She begged staff to keep her under close supervision, convinced that her stalker would find her even there. Nurses noted her agitation and her refusal to be left alone. She spoke often about the inevitability of her death, of a shadow that followed her wherever she went. After several weeks, she was released. Doctors determined she was not a danger to others but remained a danger to herself. She was prescribed a medication for depression and anxiety, but her paranoia only deepened. Strained relationships. Her parents and sister tried to rally around her, but they too were exhausted by the years of turmoil. Cindy's father, Otto, was frustrated with the police's inaction but privately admitted to wondering if his daughter's mind had betrayed her. Her sister, meanwhile, alternated between fierce loyalty, insisting that Cindy was telling the truth, and doubt. Her relationship with Roy Makepeace, her ex-husband, became increasingly complicated. Though he continued to offer support, some of Cindy's friends began to suspect his involvement in her torment. Cindy herself was conflicted. At times, she suspected Roy of orchestrating the campaign against her, pointing to his occasional displays of control. At other times, she clung to him as one of the few people who still believed her. This push-and-pull dynamic further destabilized Cindy's emotional world. She longed for stability, yet even in the presence of her closest confidants, she felt unsafe. The second hospitalization. By 1988, Cindy's fragile stability collapsed once again. After being discovered wandering half-conscious in a ditch, with nylon stockings knotted around her neck and her hands bound, she was rushed to the hospital. Police were baffled. How could Cindy have tied herself up in such a way? It was theoretically possible, they admitted, but extremely difficult. Once again, there was no evidence of another perpetrator. Cindy was hospitalized, and this time, doctors pushed harder. They increased her medication regimen and urged her to confront the possibility that she was inflicting these injuries on herself. Cindy remained adamant. Someone was after her. Friends who visited her described the experience as surreal. Cindy oscillated between lucidity, calmly explaining her fears, and complete paranoia, convinced that her stalker was in the hospital, watching her. At night, she refused to sleep without the lights on. The slow decline. Over time, Cindy began to withdraw more completely from the world. She worked less, socialized less, and lived more as a recluse. Her house, once warm and inviting, now felt barren and hostile. She surrounded herself with guard dogs and surveillance equipment, but nothing provided peace. Every letter in the mail, every phone call, every creak in the night became evidence in her mind that the campaign against her was still active. Those around her couldn't decide what to believe. Some were convinced Cindy was the tragic victim of a cunning tormentor who had eluded justice for years. Others suspected that the tormentor was Cindy herself, her own psyche manifesting terror in tangible ways. But one thing was certain: Cindy was unraveling, her grip on life slipping further with each breakdown, each hospitalization, and each unanswered question. And, tragically, it was all leading toward a conclusion more disturbing than anyone could have predicted. By the spring of 1989, Cindy James was a shell of the vibrant, witty, intelligent nurse she once had been. For 7 long years, she had endured torment unlike anything most people could imagine. Phone calls in the dead of night, menacing notes, silent stalkers lurking in the shadows, brutal physical attacks that left her battered and hospitalized. Her life had become a dark loop of fear, suspicion, and hopelessness. Her family, her friends, and even the authorities were divided into 2 camps. Those who believed Cindy was the victim of a relentless stalker and those who suspected her trauma was the manifestation of her own fragile, unraveling psyche. But on May 25, 1989, the line between victim and perpetrator blurred forever when Cindy James vanished for the last time. The day of the disappearance. It was a warm, breezy day in Richmond, British Columbia. Cindy had taken the day off work from her nursing position at Blenheim House, a private care facility for children with behavioral and emotional difficulties. Her colleagues noticed she seemed calmer lately, but only in the way a person accepts their fate rather than fights it. She still carried the weight of exhaustion in her voice and dark circles beneath her eyes, but she had smiled more in recent weeks. That morning, Cindy ran errands. She stopped by her local bank, did some grocery shopping, and chatted with a friend on the phone. There was no sign of distress, no foreshadowing of the horror about to unfold. By evening, she was scheduled to meet her ex-husband, Dr. Roy Makepeace, for dinner. Cindy never showed up. The abandoned car. 2 hours later, passers-by discovered Cindy's car, a beige Ford Tempo, parked in the lot of a neighborhood shopping mall. At first, it seemed like nothing unusual, but upon closer inspection, the scene was chilling. Blood was smeared across the driver's side door. Items from Cindy's purse, credit cards, groceries, her wallet, were scattered beneath the vehicle. A single nylon stocking, knotted like a garrote, lay crumpled on the driver's seat. Police were immediately alerted. To investigators, the car looked like the stage for an abduction, or something orchestrated to resemble one. The search for Cindy began. 2 weeks of silence. For 2 agonizing weeks, her family and friends lived in limbo. Posters were plastered across Richmond, appeals were made on local television, and volunteers combed the surrounding fields and neighborhoods. But the silence was deafening. Cindy had seemingly vanished into thin air. Her father, Otto, and her mother, Tilly, pleaded publicly for her safe return. Her sister, Melanie, admitted she feared the worst. Then, on June 8, 1989, the terrible truth emerged. The discovery. Just over a mile from where her car had been abandoned, a construction worker stumbled upon Cindy's body in the backyard of an abandoned house. The scene was gruesome and bewildering. Cindy was lying on the ground, her hands and feet bound with black nylon stockings. Another stocking was tied tightly around her neck. Her body was badly decomposed, suggesting she had been dead for days. Scattered around her were personal items, her shoes, keys, and wallet, almost as though they had been deliberately placed. An autopsy revealed a lethal overdose of morphine and other drugs in her system. The binding of her hands and feet was so tight it seemed impossible she could have tied them herself. Yet, toxicologists determined the amount of drugs would have incapacitated her long before such restraints could have been secured. The case was now darker, murkier, and more horrifying than ever. Murder or suicide? The coroner's inquest convened in 1990 to determine Cindy's cause of death. It quickly became one of the most contentious in Canadian history. The suicide theory. Police, who had long been skeptical of Cindy's claims, leaned toward suicide or an elaborate self-orchestrated scenario. They argued, Cindy had a long history of mental health struggles and hospitalizations. She had attempted suicide before. The drugs in her system pointed toward intentional overdose. The bindings, though tight, could have been self-applied in a staged suicide attempt. The murder theory. Cindy's family and friends vehemently disagreed. They argued, Cindy had told people repeatedly she believed she was being targeted and would eventually be killed. The knots and bindings on her body were too intricate for self-restraint, especially while under the influence of morphine. The placement of her body and belongings appeared staged to confuse investigators. Cindy had recently begun to show signs of hope. She had even spoken about moving forward with her life. The verdict. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned an unusual verdict. Cindy James died of an unknown event. Not suicide. Not murder. Not an accident. Simply undetermined. The ambiguity left the James family shattered. Cindy's mother wept, saying, "We just want the truth. We just want to know what really happened to her." Theories and lingering questions. More than 3 decades later, Cindy's death remains one of the most unsettling, unsolved cases in Canadian history. Theories still swirl. The mysterious stalker. Cindy's 7 years of terror were the work of a sadistic stalker who escalated to murder. The police failed to catch him, and Cindy paid the ultimate price. Psychological spiral. Cindy's trauma manifested into self-harm and staged attacks. Her final act was a desperate, elaborate suicide designed to resemble homicide. Both at once. Some believe Cindy may have started with real harassment, but over time, mental illness compounded her fear, leading her to participate in her own unraveling. In the end, the line between perpetrator and victim blurred so much that the truth became impossible to untangle. Legacy of a tormented life. Cindy James' case continues to haunt criminologists, psychologists, and true crime enthusiasts. She was only 44 years old when she died, her life swallowed by a web of fear and mystery. Her story has been retold in books, documentaries, and podcasts, often sparking fierce debate. Was she a tragic victim of a sadistic tormentor who slipped through the cracks? Or was she a deeply troubled woman whose mind created the very nightmare that consumed her? The only certainty is that Cindy James lived and died in terror, whether from an external predator or the demons within her own mind. And in the end, the greatest cruelty is that we may never know which is true.